Welcome back to the Transection Podcast. You can find us on Facebook at Transection Podcast, on Instagram at Transection Podcast, and on Twitter at Transection P. And you can also find us on the web at www.mixharrishill.com/transection.
So for those of you who joined us for episode 4, where we talked about trauma and PTSD and healing from those things with Amanda Wells, thank you for listening. If you've not heard it yet, it's a really, really good one. And trauma and PTSD are things that actually all of us deal with at one point or another, whether that's personally or supporting people that we know. It's a really important issue and topic. So if you haven't heard it, go back. And if you know anybody who would really benefit from hearing about healing and other things that you can do to get better with and cope with those issues, please do share the episode with them. This week, we're talking about the intersection of religion, spirituality, and as the LGBTQ plus community. This is something that really interests me because so much of the LGBT community and the rights movement and everything is interestingly devoid of spirituality, whether that's a non-denominational spirituality or a religion. And I think that, Jordan, you'll agree with me that we often have a very complicated relationship with religion, which is where most of us are first introduced to the concept of spirituality. And it's complicated because I think that for many of us, we do need to have that connection to feel significant and valued in the universe and in the world, and to feel that we are part of something bigger than ourselves, and to have faith that we're here for a reason, or maybe that things must get better, or just to find that strength in really difficult times. And I think that our conversations, we're so careful not to mention anything like that because of our shared trauma, that we often are left with nothing and actually devoid of the spiritual connection that we can make without organized religion.
Yeah, and I think you're right when you said that, it's our first experience with spirituality. And so we tend to intermingle religion and spirituality, and especially in the more mainstream religions where people like us don't have a place, or it's hard or complicated to find a place, it becomes trauma for us. And so a lot of us fall away from whatever religion we were raised as or connected to as youth as we become adults, and we kind of lose the touch of our spirituality with ourselves. And I've noticed among my friends, and I don't know if this is, the whole community or if it's just my little group of queer non-binary people, but I found a lot of people do find a lot of strength in like pagan religions or practices where they do find a lot of spirituality. You got to like kind of pick everything apart as you get into that, because I found myself as I've gotten into it having thoughts or being pushed into a way that was connected to the mainstream religion I was raised in that don't go with spirituality. So it's like unpicking everything is, I guess that's the common theme about everything, is you got to unpick. And it's hard to talk about because you're not just in pieces of yourself, you're unpicking trauma.
Yeah, definitely. And I think when, especially if you have any regard for this stuff, and I think most of us, even when we're young, possibly do, because it's what our parents think. And obviously for a lot of kids, even if they don't have a good relationship with their parents, they do idolize their parents a little bit sometimes, especially if they're neglected or not loved in the way that they need to be. And I think to try to fit in and emulate our parents possibly into an institutional organization that doesn't recognize us, in most cases actually says that the way that we are is unacceptable and something to be ashamed about, constantly criticized for. I think that I mean, for me personally, it took me a very long time to drop all of my religious explorations and then come back around to something that was so powerful and so beautiful for me, that didn't leave me with those kind of flashbacks and tainted bits from a religion that doesn't recognize me, doesn't talk about me, and doesn't speak about me with love.
Yeah, that's like the big part is they don't speak about us with love. And the church I was raised in is very, very, very much they preach, love everyone, shower them with kindness, that type of thing, love
Mm.
everybody. But then I would have to go sit in church, sessions. We'd have it every Sunday for 3 hours, and then we would have something called mutual on either Tuesday or Wednesday for an hour and a half or so. So twice a week I was in church, and I would have to sit through these lessons where one that's particularly stuck with me, and having communications with other people that have left the church and gone through this and gone through similar traumas as I have, is we have this lesson, and the one that was taught to me, it was a fresh $20 bill, and my leader got up and was
Mm.
talking about it and says, you want this, but everybody's a $20 bill, but when you do this, and then you crumbled it up and then like stepped on it. It was like when you have the choice between a crumpled $20 bill and a crisp one, you're gonna go for the crisp $20 bill, and
Mm.
that's what you are when you um, not just have sex before marriage, but like any like French kissing is against the rules. Um, they call it heavy petting. You're not allowed to do any heavy petting, which is just making out and grinding up on each other or whatever. But it was very much like if you do any of that, you are now seen as undesirable. And I had to sit through this,
Yeah.
from the ages of 13 to 18, knowing that I was already that crumpled dollar bill, that crumpled $20 bill, and it wasn't even me. Like, it wasn't even my choice. And I was already someone
Mm.
who was going to be seen as undesirable and not worthy of marriage in that church. And that's, I
Mm.
mean, traumatizing, even to probably the girls who were still quote unquote pure. It's traumatizing to be told that, like, you're an item, you're something that is to be coveted and preserved, and yeah,
Like a
yeah,
gem.
and that's your only purpose. And the church promotes that the purpose of woman is to procreate. Your job is to make babies. That's it. Make babies, raise babies. That's all you're there for. And so, especially over the last couple of years, there's been a lot of unrest over that. There was a huge thing where women were protesting to be able to hold the priesthood or to be able to wear pants to church, and there was a whole thing over that. And then the one most relevant to me is there was a man named Sam Young, and him and his wife began to stand up and speak out against the church and its policies, because we would have these things called worthiness in interviews with our bishop, which is like I guess he's like the equivalent of like a Catholic priest, but they're just kind of ordinary people that just get called by the church to do it. So I mean, they have really no qualifications or experience, but basically you had to go in and sit
Mm.
in these interviews with this bishop, and he would ask you if you touched yourself, or if you were having sex with someone. And these started as young as like 8 years old. And I remember having these at
Oh.
like 13 and 14. And then it was in one of these interviews where, after my abuse came out, and I was in therapy I was going to a therapist office that was owned by this church. And both my therapist and my bishop told me that I needed to sit and think about my actions and my responsibility for my abuse.
Mm.
And I I'm very open about the fact that I have PTSD and that I've been dealing with that. But what a lot of people don't know is that a great majority of my trauma is not from the abuse, it's from everything that happened to me the 5 years after, while I still was in that church and still lived
Yeah.
at home. And I mean, I had a good home, and I do have parents that love me and that still support, like my dad still supports me now, but they weren't there in the capacity I needed them to be there for me when I was going through this. And so I dealt a lot
mm,
with this trauma growing up, going to these church lessons, being told that I am now undesirable and unworthy of marriage. I'm also having massive like a gender identity crisis. I don't know who I am. I don't know where I'm going. I don't know where my place is in this world. I have no access to anything. I mean, social media wasn't really around yet. Like Facebook was just starting up when I was a junior or senior, but I wasn't allowed on the internet. So I didn't have access to anybody. I was cut off from people. People I was allowed to be with, I mean, they didn't understand. It was a small town, and so I just remember going in and sitting in the pew every Sunday and listening to people talk about how someone like me wasn't worthy of anything. And a
mm,
couple years ago, this church came out with a statement and said that children of gay parents would not be allowed to be baptized in this church. And it was awful. Like being told you can't make a decision about your religion because of your parents. And they also do preach that the being gay is not a sin, but acting on it is. So there's a lot of
mm,
people that are openly gay in straight marriages in this church. And I can't even imagine what that feels like. They came out with that, and then they've also kind of, they didn't really change the policy per se. They just kind of reworded it and then made a statement about it because they became under fire this year. Someone like me, the second I get any type of surgery, I think I even now, just because I'm on hormones and I've done a medical transition on my body, that I will never ever be able again, no matter what I do, if I detransition or anything like that, be able to go back into their temple. And so it's kind of like that was the point when I made the decision that I was like, why am I even in this church anymore? Because there's very intense about their membership. Um, so I had never like formally
mm.
withdrawn. Like you can't just leave the church. You have to like submit a request. And so people would still be coming to my apartment all of the time. Or if I moved, they would get a hold of my family members and be like, "Hey, do you know where Jordan lives?" And they'd show up to my house. And uh, so in order to stop that, I had to use a lawyer to get my names removed from the records. And now that I'm on the outside, it
How old were you when you had to request that your name or
happened
get
last
your
year.
lawyer
I
involved?
did it last year, so I was 27 years old when I finally got my name removed. And honestly, I only think one of my siblings knows that I did this. So if any of them, like, this is me putting myself up for a whole lot of potential issues with my family admitting this right now. But yeah, I had my name removed from the church records, and it honestly was like this huge weight lifted off of my shoulders that I was finally free from this institution that had caused me so much pain. And it's hard because my dad always would come and say, you can't truly be happy unless you're following the church. And then of course with someone with depression, um, when I left the church and when I wasn't active and I had depression, there was a lot of years where I thought that that was because I wasn't going to church and had a lot of fear about it. And as I've grown older and realized, like that's depression is depression. That's something that was unrelated, but I'm still trying to unfuck myself from all of these little sayings and things that were pushed in my mind about being perfect. And Utah has a really really high suicide rate, especially among youth. And people are like, well, I don't understand why, but it's when you look at the culture, it's a very much a perfectionism religion where everything's in a glass house and you
Yeah,
have to be absolutely perfect. The main concentration of where this we like to call Happy Valley because they're one of the highest usages of antidepressants. It's just kind of like you got to really think about why that people with so many mental health issues and struggles and because they're trying to attain this perfect ideal that's not possible. It's not human. And even so, I haven't been active in the church for probably 8 or 9 years, and I'm have been actively trying to unpick everything from myself, and I still am doing it. It so wholly consumed me that I had a lot of anger for a long time against religion, especially this one, and I still hold on to quite a bit of anger, but I realize, that it's into an institution, and me going around and yelling at everybody isn't really going to do much. But I lost that connection with my own spirituality, which I realized was very important to me. And so now I've been going around and trying to find, where can I find my spirituality? So I've been talking with people and exploring not just religions, but practices that are available to people with my cultural heritage, because it's not my place to get into other cultures. So I like learning about them, but it's been really cool just getting into these pagan and these hedonistic cultures and practices, and just kind of finding my place there, and finding myself, uh, becoming more in tune with myself, which is funny because
Mm.
like my therapist did teach me how to meditate. The first one I went to that caused me a lot of problems, but he did teach me to meditate. So he gave me one really really good tool, and I found that the things I felt as I was searching myself back then and the things I'm feeling now are very much in the same. And it's finding peace in allowing me to be who I am. And whenever I lose
Mm.
that is when I start trying to perform to be somebody else, to perform to be palatable to people. And I start losing myself in that. I try really hard to be palatable. And this podcast has been one of the things where I'm very happy I'm doing, because I'm helping educate and bring awareness to it. And I've been doing this since I came out with anybody and everybody. And I noticed about 8 months ago that I'm having the same three conversations over and over and over again with the same people. I can't go anywhere without somebody bringing up who I am. And it's frustrating. And I'm like,
Mm.
I want to talk about things other than being trans. Like, I have to deal with this every day of my life. I'm talking about it all of the time, and I can't have, like, every single time I was talking to my tattoo artist for the last 2 years has gone to the exact same conversation. And so finally I said something on Saturday. I was like, look, like, I love you, but can we please talk about something, like anything else? Because I'm tired of, having these conversations. And he said to me, he called me a moderator and said that, and he also apologized and said, it's just nice to talk to you, because when I bring up some things that may not be correct or anything like that, you don't freak out on me. And I'm just like, I'm this close to like doing it, but it's when I kind of realized that I'm honing down my edges to make myself palatable to people because they're
Mm.
uncomfortable. And I'm kind of done with it. Like, when I do that, I lose connection with myself. And when I lose connection with myself, I lose connection to my spirituality. And then my depression gets worse, and I get angry, and I'm irritable all the time, and I don't like it. So it's kind of,
That's
don't break yourself off into bite sized pieces, make them choke on you whole. I'm getting so aggressive with all of it, but it's important to me because bringing awareness and bringing education is part of who I am, and I can't have the connection with myself if I am dulling myself down to make myself more palatable.
definitely. And I think that's so much of religion, and not all,
Yeah.
hashtag not all religion. um, but so much of it is really about being
Mhm.
subservient and denying all of these different parts of yourself in order to tread this tightrope of unrealistic standards that wasn't ever really set by the original founders or inspirations for the religions. It's much more of a current culture.
It
And when you're describing, like, within your, the church that you grew up in, and how, your area is so highly medicated for depression, and yet they have such incredibly narrow margins. Like, there's no margin for error, and it's impossible as a human to be that way, I think, most of the time. And it doesn't surprise me that when the margins for error are pretty much non-existent, that people are depressed. I can't imagine going around every single day permanently in this sort of hyper-vigilant state where you're questioning every single thing that you
yeah.
do, your tone of voice and the way that you speak to people who you're told are superior to you. and it's so unhealthy. And yeah, it really doesn't surprise me. It's interesting though, because I do often think about the contrast between the UK and the US, and I mean, I guess we're more similar than we're not, but I do find that so we do have so many similar issues, but especially around oppression and other things like that, we tend to have our versions are much more subtle, and they're quiet, and they're done in a way that you almost can't quite put your finger on it, like it's
Uh-huh.
really insidious. My younger sister got married a few years ago, and her husband is never grown up or never really been like a religious person. His family aren't religious, but they agreed that they would have their wedding in the church that we grew up going to. We were talking about it, and my sister said, "Would you get married in a church?" And I said, "Well, I don't know if I could. I don't know if I could get married in a church. It depends who I fall in love with and how the law recognizes my gender versus the other gender, and is the church okay with that?" And to be honest, like maybe I would have done if I got married young, but now absolutely not. Like, why would I want to get married in a place that only accepts me in certain ways? And if the law forces me to be recognized as female or male, and then depending on who I fall in love with, would really be the deciding factor as to whether or not they'd allow me to get married in the building. It's so different because nobody's actually said anything to me, and yet leaving the church and realize and just being like, I don't want to go back there. And I tried so many different places to see if I could find something different. And by the end of it, I just didn't want to go back. I felt so unwelcome when actually nobody had said anything to my face whatsoever. I think additionally, my grandmother was from India, and I've always been really aware of race within my family. But in retrospect, I think I was the only one, because the Indian side of the family for years were in denial about that, where they were from and what color they actually are. That's been really strange. And I often felt like being in a church of pretty much mostly white people, and even the culture of the church and even the Church of England is so patriarchal and so white that I was never going to be at home there anyway. And I just feel that until a religion can become as fluid as its people, and as because the whole point, as far as I'm concerned, is that religion, first and foremost, is meant to be about
Hmm.
spiritual nourishment, but yet it's used as control. And I mean, in certain countries, including the UK, for many centuries, the law and the religion, as far as I understand it, were exactly the
Yeah.
same thing. It wasn't separate most of the time. And so that's where I think it's kind of got
I mean,
corrupted. I'm pretty
that's
sure.
how the Church of England was
But if,
started, was because the church and the law
yeah,
didn't allow, was it King Henry VIII? So he created the Church of England.
it's very subtle, and it's kind of almost so quietly done. I feel that because of all that subtlety, it took me such a long time, and I could never. I feel that because of growing up in this kind of very middle class, and most of the people that I know are white, because of all of those things, and there's this very English way of like, don't be upset, stiff upper lip, don't express yourself, don't lose your shit, don't tell people to fuck off if you think they're wrong. So I feel like everything is still done to you. It's still done to you the same way it's done to people
Hmm.
in the US. But it's just done in a way that you can't really criticize it. You can't call them out because nobody's saying anything awful to your face. I mean, of course that
Yeah.
does happen to other people, but from my experience, it's just so quietly and subtly done, and in such a polite way. Like, you can be a bigot and be really polite about it, especially in England. I would say that if it was a sport, that England would win.
I, you're right.
To Yeah, and I remember I moved. So the last time I attended church regularly, okay, so growing up, I went to Church of England, but everybody was very kind of liberal about it. We didn't really talk about religion much at home at all, especially not God or spirituality. It was more of like a community thing that we did. Then by my teens, I started to notice what other people said about it. And we had Sunday lunch is very traditional in my house. We still do it now, even though we're not churchgoers. I mean, my dad still goes to sing in the choir when we're not disbanded due to lockdown. But you know, he's not spiritual as far as I'm aware. The last time I asked him, he was like, no. But we had, in my teens, I remember this one particular Sunday lunch with a bunch of friends from church and people who are sort of like honorary grandparents. And I remember one of the ladies, she just turned around and was like, but nobody really believes it though, do they? And I remember thinking, like, what the fuck is the point in any of this then? And everyone else sort of laughed about it. And I was like, why have I spent years internalizing this fucking biased and filtered and corrupted stuff, and taking it so seriously and taking it so to heart, when all of the people that I have been socializing with and building relationships for years with, they don't believe it themselves. Like, who am I trying to please here? And so eventually I just went, no, fuck off, I'm not going. Like, what's the point? It's not real. And you know, I started asking people, why do you go? And they're like, oh, I like the singing, or I like to go and see my friends, or it's what I've always done. And eventually I was like, well, what's the bloody point? And then so I left religion alone for ages. And when I moved up to the Midlands for uni, I was only there for a term, and then I jacked it in. I went to go and be a stripper. I got involved with this chap, and again, that's another story for another time. This whole chapter of mine, where I kind of got involved in all these interesting things, some of them fine and some of them really not. And after all of that chapter, you know, there'd been like I had to end a pregnancy and got broken up with and ditched while pregnant, and there was like, not me, but I was then dealing with somebody who had a heroin problem, and there was just all sorts of things going on. And after all of that, I just was like, I don't want to be around, I don't want to date anymore. And the guy that had got me pregnant and had the heroin addiction actually got me back into Christianity, which is such a, I don't know,
What?
like, so contradictory, isn't it? I don't know, but he was just a really messed up Christian, and he was an addict. He was like a terribly traumatized person, not a bad person at all, but he's just very, very messed up and very immature. He behaved in a lot of ways that were very unkind, kind of. Well, I don't know. It's just like lashing out. It's just like watching a child sometimes. And he was 12 years older than me as well. So anyway, but he would often talk in these weird moments, or these moments where he would kind of be almost like more lucid, or remember who he was and stop reaching for things that he didn't believe in, or I don't know, he would seesaw between all of these different ideals and how he felt versus what he believed. And he would talk about religious things and concepts, and he was talking about it in a universally spiritual way, and I've used the term universally in a, like, broadly speaking. But for example, he would use phrases like "so heavenly minded, no earthly good." He would say things all the time as a philosophy, and as it being spiritual. And he also had read the Quran and other religious texts, and he had a genuine interest in it. And I thought, this is much more me. I want to be educated about it and to know about how all of this works and what's the universal truth of all of this, and the really deep stuff. I'm not interested in, you know, going to kneel at the altar every week for wafer and wine when nobody here believes it's anything other than a free snack. Like, what's the point?
Terrible snack.
So no, and I only found out when it was too late that
Oh no.
Jesus is not gluten-free. You have to request, if you're celiac, you have to request
Jesus.
gluten-free
Oh
Jesus.
my God.
But yeah, so anyway, so basically, after I'd gone through all that trauma with like having to end a pregnancy and being like horrifically sad about that, and sorry, that was a bit of a contrast, wasn't it? Gluten-free Jesus to that.
We
But
kind
yeah,
of do that.
anyway. So sorry, serious face. Okay. So after I'd gone through all of that, I was like, I don't want any man to come near me again. I don't want anyone to like touch me like that. I don't feel safe. And because I've got pregnant as well, being careful. So I was really freaked out. So I guess like maybe that's really funny and ironic that I got pregnant despite precautions or despite not thinking I could, and then turned to Christianity again. Like Mary all over again. No, it's not really. Um, so I tried out an evangelical church, a really big one in Leicester, in the Midlands of England. I know to American people it probably sounds funny. It's just the middle of England. It's like, you know, you've got the bottom and then the middle and then the top. It's pretty simple. Anyway, so I tried out the evangelical church, and they had really good music because it was massive, and they had these really good musicians. But it was full of theatre and ego and absolute bullshit. And I actually called them out on it. And this was amazing, actually. I don't care what you think of it. I just enjoy the story. This young couple who was supposedly blessed with the gift of sight, like reading for people in this sort of spiritual sense. And they recorded what they were saying to me on a tape, on like a cassette tape. And I took it home and I listened to it again, and I was like, this is such bullshit. And I said, right, God, if this is, I don't believe this, or I'm not sure if I do. If this isn't true, what they've said to me on this tape, can you give me a sign? Press play, and after about a minute, the tape snapped in
Well, there you
half.
go.
And that's never happened to me before. And I'm not saying it's a miracle or it is or whatever. It was just, I was like, that's really interesting. I think other than that, and I just ended up saying that this older couple who were really lovely, actually, they really took me under their wing, and they could see I was really traumatized. I think she was a midwife or a nurse. They really looked after me, but I just said to them, look, your music in the church is amazing, but other than that, I just see a lot of showmanship and ego, and it's just not real. I'm sorry. And then after that, I tried a Pentecostal church. I was the only non-black person there, and it was tiny. The music was really dire, but the preaching and the community and the conversation was brilliant, and that's why I stayed at that one for a while. And I actually got
I
re-baptized
think
there. And then,
journey here
yeah,
is that one of your standards as you go from church to church is the music.
yeah, probably. It's just
Yeah.
what you notice. I think for me, like you've got the musical part, and I think for a lot of people, music is
Mhm.
very like emotional and can be spiritual and put you in particular mindset, you know. And it's that coming together, isn't it,
Yeah.
and putting your energies together. I think it's something a bit magic about that, whether you're religious or spiritual or not. But also like what people are preaching, what's the message in the church? And sometimes I think, well, you know, you've got an audience of hundreds of people who are there to be spiritually guided, and you might as well have just literally dropped your kegs and took a shit on the floor. Like that was just completely pointless. And then after all of that, I ended up basically, my dad thought that I was being brainwashed. And I thought this was so funny because the only time that I'd ever been brainwashed by a religion is the one that he and my mum introduced me to, without any kind of like warning, or there was no kind of balanced conversation that went on about what we discussed or what we listened to that week. And that was the point where I was too young to really do anything, like to question it particularly. So by the time I ended up in these other places as an adult, I'd chosen to go there and find out about it. And I'd chosen to take part in that. And that was the time when my dad was like, oh, I think you're being brainwashed and I want you to move home. And then after I moved home, so the guy, the friend who introduced me, and he was still going to church with me, even though he was like high some of the time. It was really weird. And when I moved back home, he said, have you found another church? And I remember just thinking, like, I just can't do it. I don't know why, but it's just so against it. And it took me years to recover from all of that, and to have the courage and the healing to then find my own way into spirituality that is lovely and completely serves me and others and keeps me striving to be a better person as well, and to like be responsible with my behavior and my thoughts and things like that, far more than a religion ever has done. So yeah. So Jordan, where are you now? Like, what do you believe, and like, where are you in finding things that you enjoy and that do bring you a sense of
Well,
like
I did.
connectedness?
I did go around and try to find a Christian-based denomination around here because the religion I was raised in is, depending on who you ask, they're either Christian or not. But honestly, the best way I can explain the religion I was raised in was like Christianity meets Judaism meets Freemasons, is what it was. So I kind of, it was
Yeah.
familiar to me. Like I'd grown up studying the Bible, and I had this thought earlier when you were talking about what your experience was growing up in religion, how it was just something the community did on the Sunday or whatever. I didn't realize how heavily the religion is forced into the children's lives. Because I just thought this is how everybody's religion was. But we would wake up, we would have family scripture study every morning, family prayer. I'd go to school, and then one of my classes at high school was seminary, where then we would study religion. Plus, then I had my 3 hours on Sundays and then my one time a week that I would go as a youth. So I mean, every day, all the time. The only day that there wasn't some type of religion was Saturday. And so I've heavily studied the Bible and the Mormon books, the Book of Mormon and the Doctrine and Covenants, and there's one called the Pearl of Great Price as well. But so I've heavily studied all of those, and so it was familiar to me. So I'm like, I'll go find a Bible-based denomination up here, and I noticed it didn't matter what they preached or what type of inclusiveness that they had or acceptance or whatever. I knew what the Bible said, and I knew that despite what any of them would say in any of the denominations, I knew what the truth was. So I never felt comfortable. No matter how welcoming they were, I've never felt comfortable. And so I just kind of fell off from Christianity, and then I had a lot of years of atheism, and so lately the thing that I found that that's really resonated with me has been witchcraft. And so that's I've been studying into that a lot.
Mm.
I joined a coven. I it's just something about the spiritual, because it's all based on spirituality. It's all based on what's within you and within the earth around you and air around you, and how, like, where your place is and all of that, and your place in the cycle, and bringing in energy. I've always been, no matter where I've sat on the religion scale or my spirituality scale, I've always been someone who believes the energy you put into the universe is something that the universe will bring back to you. And so that really coincides really, really well with
Mm.
uh, the pagan roots I'm going after. So that's what I found. So I've gotten into tarot, and I've got my own little shelf that I've made that I have, I think it's calcite that one of my friends sent me. I've got some incense and stuff. And so I'm kind of slowly wading into that. And that's how I found my spirituality, is in a non-Christian or Abrahamic based religion.
Yeah, that's nice. It's interesting actually, because so I listen to all of my books. I can't really sit and read like I used to. There are some books I've come across in recent years about Jesus and other things, and originally I would see these and think I'm curious, but it's still not been enough time. I need some distance from it. But I've found since then that so many people and like scholars, particularly of the Bible, have come along and they've said, well, a lot of the things that we know now about the origins of like the original words, or the the language, the earliest languages we have recorded of like versions of the Bible or books of the Bible or whatever, a lot of these translations are actually very different, and it's not what you've been led to believe. So yeah, one of the ladies who worked, she used to be a nun. She's a retired nun, and then she worked as a reader at the church I grew up at for some years before fully retiring. And she used to be a nun, and she studied a lot of these things from an academic point of view. And she was the first person to say to me that the original words before things got translated into Latin or English and other things was that any discussion of homosexuality wasn't actually about homosexuality. It was a discussion about the slave trade
That
of
was going to be the thing
boys.
that I was going to bring up if this wasn't where you were going, is because
And
that's
in
the one
those,
I know about.
originally there was nothing said at all about LGBT people. Now, the fact that we weren't mentioned particularly is not necessary. You know, you can't argue that they didn't have a problem at all. but certainly it wasn't enough that it was brought up particularly. And they also talked about like eunuchs and people like that, but I think there are quite a few theories about what that literally meant. But again, I feel that regardless of interpretation, the number one rule was to love people, and I'm pretty sure that didn't include like just being a bit of a dick at the very least. Yeah, so I mean, I've learned loads of things since then, and I think had I got access to a lot of the original things, and especially like it was meant to be, the whole idea of Christianity originally, that anybody could be a Christian and that you didn't have to give up what you were in order to be a Christian. You know, like Jesus was always a Jew. He didn't stop being a Jew. And even the Last Supper was Pesach, was Passover meal. I think originally it was really meant to be this kind of fluid, all accepting thing where it's like radical love of other people and real trust that things are, you know, we are wonderfully and fearfully made. And I think, I mean, I'm not Christian now, but I definitely think that there is value at the root of it. I just really reject the religion, because in all the reading that I've done about the earlier days and things before it got turned into a tool for control and to generate wealth, before that there was just something really amazing about it, and it was very revolutionary for the time, and there was a lot of persecution going on as well. So I really do feel that the version of religion we've got now is just not, it's so diluted, it's been so corrupted over centuries of white men and white supremacy and, you know, sexism, misogyny and everything else. And I mean we even forget, or we're not even told, that Mary, you used to think about like Mother Mary and Mary Magdalene. Mary is not a name, it's a
I didn't
title that
know
means priestess. Yeah. So the point, yes, and also a lot of um, Jewish culture is based around matriarchy, not patriarchy.
that. Mhm.
Not to say that there aren't issues and so on, but women were always, like, in many ways and in many variations within Jewish culture, women are highly revered. So I feel that what we have now is such a dilution and such a corruption and a misrepresentation of what it was meant to be originally. And of course, that's always going to happen. But I feel that it's just happened in the same way over and over and over again until this is what we've got. And it makes people miserable. So what's the point? I'm not saying don't be religious, and I'm not saying that religion is evil. I just think that we should be mindful of all of the things that I've mentioned and all of the other things that I don't know and haven't brought up or whatever. But I think that we can be religious and keep these things in mind, and be religious and not take doctrine because it's there without questioning it. I think religion is meant to serve people, and it's meant to get them to like a good mental state. And if that means learning not to judge and learning to really love people and connect with them in a really deep and really fearless way, then that's what it should be doing. And if it's not, then it needs to be looked at. So for the last like 6 years, I've been listening to loads and loads of
Mhm.
audiobooks about all kinds of things: spirituality, psychology, behavior, and trauma, and all sorts of things. And I've listened to loads and loads. And I think what I've got now, somebody would probably say it's a bit new age, but I massively reject that, because there's no such thing as new age. All these ideas were known many thousands of years ago and got nothing to do with now, I don't think. But I think what I've got now is a bit of oh, I've forgotten the word again. Why does that happen? Oh, reincarnation. There you go. I found it. Bit of reincarnation, bit of law of attraction, but
Ow.
mitigated with walking, working through your
Uh-huh.
trauma, and also respecting the path. So I don't. So for example, like, are you a power of
Yeah.
are you a manifesting person?
Yeah.
Yeah. So when I first heard about it, I was like, it makes sense, and I can, like, 100 times I've manifested my exact favorite parking spot and all of that shit. But what I found is that you can't manifest something that is so
Mhm.
far out of
You
your
can't just manifest it. You have to actually actively work for it. And if you have something that's blocking your way, like trauma.
That's another thing. Like if you have trauma around money, like I've definitely, that's something that I've dealt with for most of my life. If you've got trauma around money, and maybe you've got like the trauma of poverty, it doesn't matter how hard you try to manifest $1 million by tomorrow. I mean, occasionally someone probably could manage to do it, the right person, but generally speaking, it sets you up to fail and to feel like a failure again. And I think that the art of manifesting is magical and it's amazing. And it can work even just psychologically, which is enough, I think, even if you don't believe in the spiritual, like divine or energetic element of it, it is still magic. However, I don't think that the current version of what we've got is responsible or well-rounded enough. It's not holistic enough. I followed all sorts of manifesting people over the times that are really good at what they do, and they've absolutely done it for themselves, and yet we don't. But they're like, oh, you don't, if you're traumatized or if you're feeling crap about something, that's because you've done something wrong, or you're not trying hard enough. And eventually, if you just don't relive your trauma, eventually it'll just go away. I'm like, that is such fucking bullshit. I think manifesting is a really good one, and I actually find a lot of people now, I'll sometimes be having like a really average conversation with somebody, and I'll be like, oh, thanks universe, and they laugh and they go, yeah, I hate it when that happens, or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, you know exactly what I'm talking about. We're not religious, and we've not said anything except I've made one comment and you agree with me, and I know that in that moment we're both talking about the same thing, which I think is really interesting. But again, I think a lot of these concepts come from like older ancient cultures or religions, and the version that we've got has probably been whitewashed to death,
Yeah,
and the poor fucking thing is hanging on
like
by a string.
when I hear
Sorry.
New Age, my brain goes whitewashed other cultures. Other cultures that have existed and practices that have existed
Mm.
for thousands of years, but because, white people in yoga pants do it now, it's New Age.
Yeah, same. I feel like if you're gonna, like someone would say, like, ask me if I'm a Buddhist, and I'll say no, because I don't know enough about it. And I've heard a lot of white people say that. I mean, anyone could be a Buddhist. The whole point is that it's almost like not
It's a
even a religion, it's
philosophy,
like an attitude or a view of life and the soul and stuff.
way of life.
Yeah, and which is fun. But I still, you know, I see so many people and they say these things, and I'm like, how, where have you got this from? Do you know whose it is? Do you know whose entire philosophy you've just made into like something that could fit onto the side of a Starbucks cup? And yeah, I agree with you. I think New Age is just
Yeah, it's
whitewashed
not new
other
by any
people's
means.
stuff. So what do you think about moving forward, Jordan? Because I really feel like, particularly as a community, I feel like, especially when we're feeling rubbish, uh, we often need that sense of connection to something bigger than ourselves, something benevolent, and feeling loved, especially if we're isolated right now, and also just socially in general. I feel like so often, on my Genders Together page, that I want to share something that I feel is spiritually so warming and just loving, but I'm scared to share it because I think just the concept of spirituality for so many of our peeps is just
Yeah,
re-traumatizing.
I
And
understand that because I feel a few years ago I probably would have seen something like
but
that and gotten upset, but it's like we've discussed this. Like it's the separation of spirituality from religion, and I think having a platform that allows you to share these and start showing that you can be spiritual without being religious, or if you want religion, like it's all up to you and it's a personal decision, but um it's scary, yeah, but it's, if you have the platform and the capability to share something that might promote healing in traumatized peoples, I think it's important.
Yeah, I agree with
But
you.
it's
Just think
good
I'm
to
still
open doors like that, like
sorry.
to open discussions. But at the same time, the most important person you have to take care of is yourself. Sometimes you need to
Yeah.
make sure that you're doing what is best for you. And if sharing something is scary to the point where you're not in a position to be able to handle any type of hurt that may come from it, you need to take care of yourself. And that goes for everybody and everything in every
Mm,
aspect. You can't pour from an empty cup.
yeah.
You have to take care of yourself in order to take care of others.
Mm.
And that's where my response
It's
to how can
mm,
we help people find their spirituality and find their communities is right now, especially with how isolated everyone is, to find your communities. There are so many communities online right now and so many platforms that I have found so much family in the groups that I've joined. There's so many, and I mean, you can literally look for um, religion or practice you're interested in, queer group, and it'll pull up, put in exactly what words you want. If you want someone in your culture, you can look up your culture. If you want someone, a group that has similarities to you in your lifestyle or in your identity or in your romantic attraction, like there's thousands of groups out there for every little thing. So you can find groups specifically catered to exactly what you need to find yourself spiritually. And in order to do that, you also need to make sure you have introspection into yourself. You want to follow what feels good to you. And if you get into something and it doesn't feel good,
mm,
don't do it. Don't push yourself to be in something that you are not comfortable with.
mm.
I was not comfortable with Christianity, but that doesn't mean somebody else isn't. Like they can be completely comfortable. And it's important to allow people to explore and to find themselves in any way they need to, as long as it's not harmful to somebody else. But that also means you can't be harmful to somebody else.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the difficulty with religion is that religion has to tell its participants that look, you need us, you need this religion. Without it, you're in trouble. Uh, you'll go to hell. Your life will be cursed. Everything you
Mhm.
do will be disgusting. And if you don't really take that seriously, then you're fucked basically. And anybody else who's doing it even slightly differently to you, or maybe, they found God but through a different religion, or they've, all of these people are just doing things slightly wrong. So lucky for you, they're not going to heaven. So you've got to work really hard to make sure that you do, and to make sure that your soul isn't any more disgusting than it already is, because that shit's gross. And they really, really need to hammer home that you need us, you cannot leave. And it's
Yeah,
it's participation, but by coercion, isn't it? And I think that the moment that you say to somebody, and that it is that setup that tells me this is wrong. And obviously lots of institutions are not like that, but it tends to be on a individual basis. And I think that because of that, that's what makes us all getting on together so difficult within this context, because you're told that anybody outside of what you're doing, they're dangerous. They might give you like bad ideas about things, or they're corrupt, so just don't get too close. Or love them, but love them and keep in mind that they're a bit disgusting, or that they're a bit like they're an abomination. Like, love them, but you can't love them without remembering
yeah,
how
I
broken and fucked up they are. And because of that, it's like it maintains this superiority complex, and I think that's what gets in the way. I think that if we're all going to get along, we have to get to a point where we can see God in each other, or we can see the divine in every single human, regardless of how they're going about their lives. And even with people who do shit things, that they have the potential. They're alive. They've been given a life, and they have potential to do good or to do at least better. And whilst pretty much like most religions have, especially in the West anyway, have this superiority complex, that's never going to happen. And obviously, whilst people are roped in and they really believe they have to be there and they have to fight for their position and they have to fight anybody who even marginally disagrees or lives a lifestyle differently, they have to do that, because otherwise, where does the church get their money? And where does the church get its power and its followers, and the numbers of supporters? I think the second that we can be more relaxed about the entire thing and accepting and not pushing people to be one thing or another, and recognizing coercion and calling it out when we see it, I think would make for much more balanced inclusion. And also, you're going to end up with more emotionally invested people when the people there are there by choice, not because you've bullied them into it, even if you think that your bullying was done out of love. I think that's the issue that we have at the moment. And because of that superiority complex, then everyone who's outside of that is like, you're being a dick. And they're like, no, I'm doing this because I love you. And there's just no, or I'm doing this because you're dirty. And because of both of those things, I think we're at loggerheads, and it's going to be so difficult to connect across the boundaries and across the borders if those things are not addressed inside and out.
You're right. That's in the church I was raised in. You were told that your friends were inside the church, and that it's dangerous to be friends with anybody outside of the church. And if you do make any, you're supposed to bring them to church with you and try to convert them. And I'm what's called now, they call me an apostate. And I'm like basically like equivalent to the devil to some of them. Yeah, basically, like once you hit apostate in this
Oh,
church, uh, you're shunned. Leaving the church, you will lose entire communities. I'm very, very lucky
oh,
that my family is still there for me. But like I have, cousins that weren't nearly as lucky, and I have friends that were kicked out of their homes when they were said that they were leaving the church, and it's you immediately become a leper, and you're the outside. You're not part of the perfect little flock anymore. And they tell you not to be friends with people that aren't in the church. Like you have to be friends with people in the church. You hang out with people in the church, and you can't. I mean, it's just kind of looking back at some of the things. It's just crazy to me that people go along with it, but they're told that families can be together forever. But all of you have to follow all of the rules to the letter. One of the nice things though about that church though is that they actually don't believe in hell. There is something called outer darkness that you could end up into, but according to, at least from what I was told, the only way to get into that is to tell Jesus to his face that he's not real. But they have like lower, like specific levels of heaven, and according to the life you live, you'll be in one of those levels. But the only way that you can be with your family and to be with God the Father and Jesus and the Holy Ghost is if you live the perfect life, get all the temple work done, all of that stuff. Otherwise, you don't get access to your family or anything like that. And they hold your family hostage. You got to pay your 10%. You got to go to church every day. You got to do the temple work. And then if you do all of these things, you get your family forever. But if you don't do these things, your family's lost to you forever. And it's really, really heartbreaking, honestly. And yeah, I'm part of a Facebook
mm,
group that is a collection of apostates like me, and I left the church way before I did any of the temple stuff. I did do the waterboarding for the dead, the baptisms for the dead they do, uh, that I was able to do as a youth, but I wasn't able to do any of like the other temple work because that for a woman you don't do that until you're married. They're doing it early and early now because they're more open to them going on missions, but you have to go through what's called an endowment session, and I'm finding out what happens in these things, and it's whew, Like, it's creepy. But I see, like, and hearing all of these people that didn't get out of the church until they're in their
Yeah.
40s or 50s, and they talk about that, like, they've always were so uncomfortable, but they were terrified to leave. They couldn't leave. They were coerced into being there. They were bullied by love. Um, they have these things called, which I probably should have been called into ages
Mm.
ago, but they're called, I think it's called a court of love, where they will call you in, and then it's basically like judge and jury sitting in front of you, and they bring you in and talk about whatever grievous sin it is that you have been said to have been committed, and then they decide on a punishment, which could be losing your temple recommend, or uh, being disfellowshipped, or even excommunicated from the church. And that's what happened to Sam Young, the one I was talking about, who was very vocal about the worthiness interviews. Is he was excommunicated for speaking up about it. And yeah, it's definitely a rule by fear and bully by
Wow.
love, or love by bullying, religion that I was raised in. So I have, like I said earlier, I have a lot of anger inside of me, that I have a hard time making sure that I keep that separated from the people, when I do talk about religion, and understand, that that person isn't the one who hurt me. It's all of it, all the teachings and everything,
Mm.
and the everything you said about how, um, they see you as dirty, and you got to make sure you're not dirty, and otherwise, you're gonna get cast out, and all the stuff like that. And it's traumatizing and hurtful and incredible that they have such a hold on people.
Mm. And I think particularly to weaponize a child's abuse against them, I
Oh yeah,
mean,
it was.
that's that's
And
next
I'm not the
level.
only one. You can make a post asking for, Mormon survivors, and you'll get story after story after story after story after story of this happening to people, and it's all on
Mm.
the woman side of it. Um, when things happen to men, it's usually like, they made a mistake, but they
Yeah.
repented and they're better now. And I mean, it's really frustrating. And I have a very, 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 very unique situation
Mm.
where I am, okay and on good terms with, the person who abused me. We were both young, and it was a cycle of abuse situation. And so it coming to light, and us getting both help was able to break that cycle for both of us. But it's a very unique situation. But it was also like they made up an excuse as to why he was in juvie, why he was in juvenile detention, than for what he was really in there. So I had to lie to people about that, about why he was in there. I wasn't allowed to talk to people about what I'd been through. I was very much like, my parents tried to get me help, but I was very much brushed under a rug for all of this. And a lot of it was to save face for my abuser. And it's so common. I mean, I was a lucky one that there was actual, police
And
intervention into what happened. I was lucky. Most of the time, it's only dealt within the family or within the church.
so was it the church that had really encouraged?
I can't say it was the church that did it, but it was very, very heavily influenced by the church. Um, the church involvement directly with me was all of the, he was like, he made a mistake and he'll be fine, but then telling me that I needed to repent and be aware of my involvement, and being told that it was my fault that I was abused. And I mean, it came to light, like, my mom approached me about it like 2 or 3 days before I turned 13. That's how young I was.
I mean, you talked a lot
Mhm.
about having PTSD, a lot around how it was handled rather than the actual abuse. So is that something that you still think about now?
I still feel like I can't talk about it. I still feel like I have to, I wonder sometimes, like, if my protection of his identity is for his sake or my sake. If I'm doing it because, like, I've forgiven him and that we are okay now, or if
Mm.
I'm doing it because I don't want to, um, tarnish his reputation. And I mean, there are a lot of people who do know and do know who it was. But I feel like I feel bad about it. Like, I shouldn't feel bad about speaking openly about what happened to me. But yeah, I definitely have a lot of trauma with that.
Yeah.
There were a couple of times as an adult that I have been assaulted, and I do a lot of internalized shame and guilt with them, that it was my fault for being in that situation, or my fault, or maybe I shouldn't have laughed at the one joke and he wouldn't have done it. Or I have a lot of that comes from, I hear my old therapist's voice in my head repeating the "where were you, what were you doing, how could you have been better, and what could you have done differently so you weren't." And so I still deal with that. I have nightmares that I have been working on getting treated for about the last year now. I finally found something that works. But my nightmares, a few of them are from being abused, but a lot of them are of me sitting. I remember the texture of the pillows and the couch I would sit on in that therapist's office, and him sitting there and asking me all of these very, very invasive questions, and then turning around and telling me how it was my fault, and I won't be able to heal until I accept that it was my fault, and all of these things like that. And that's the trauma I have. Those are the nightmares I have. Are I mean, I can, even in these nightmares, I can smell the
Mm.
couch. It's that vividly traumatic for me. And I know I talk about them, but like that I have them, but this is the
Yeah.
first time I've actually brought up like the nightmares I do have. So yeah, when I talk about how my PTSD is less from my trauma, like I still have it there, but the great, probably like 80% of the stuff I've had to deal with in therapy have been my therapy and the stuff I had to go through with the church. I've talked through the
Mm.
$20 bill thing with my therapist. Like it's I remember the first time I went to a therapist that I picked myself and was ready just to kind of unpick all of this. This was back in early 2018. And I was in my intake and I was talking to her, and she kind of asked, why I was there. And I kind of gave like a brief synopsis of why I was there and the things I had gone through with my previous therapist. And when I looked up at her, her jaw was on the floor. And she wanted to report him, and because of
Mm.
how heinous and unethical it was that I had been through. And it was that moment then I realized that, like, oh, like I just was validated in all of my pain and my anger and my hurt. And now I can start to heal from it. And so, I mean, it's been what 2.5 years now. Before the pandemic was hitting, I was seeing a psychiatrist once a month, and I've made huge strides, and I'm doing really, really well. But I mean, it's almost 16 years of my life I've been dealing with this now. 16 years this August since it ended.
So, Jordan, do you feel that all of those, I mean, do you see a link with the church and the culture of the church to all of the things surrounding that abuse, the other parts that you are traumatized aside from the abuse itself? Do you think that, like, do you really see
Yes,
the church influencing
absolutely.
all of that, all of the
The whole
situation?
culture provides it. I mean, the worthiness interviews where a grown man who was not a therapist or an educated clergyman or anything like that. He's just I mean, one of the ones I had when I was in high school, he was an accountant. Um, but, at 12, 13, 14 years old, you're alone in this room with this man asking you these very explicit questions. So that type of culture that makes it normalized. There is a very, very, very dark and insidious history of child sex abuse in the church that is very commonly known but not talked about. Like I said, if you went out and made a post, "Hey, I'm looking for Mormon survivor stories," and I said that, you
Yeah.
would just get story after story after story after story. It's all related, and all of them have uh, the same. Like how I said, I was told that it was my fault. That's a church thing. That wasn't these two particular men saying it on their own. It's what they are told to tell us. So absolutely. And so that's why I have a really, really hard time
Yeah.
with religion as a whole, is because that's what I was subjected to. Um, but I am, you know, I try really hard to
Mm,
be like understanding and accepting, and um, I can be around like people that are in the church. I can be around my family and stuff like that. But it is really, really hard. Every time I come back from seeing my family, I have to take a day or two just to get the ick out of my out of my body, out of the way I feel, because I just feel gross. And I know it's what they believe, and
yeah.
that that they seem happy, and I'm happy for
Mm.
them. But like, it's knowing all of these things and what I've been through, and having the knowledge I have, not the faith, but the knowledge I have, it just makes me feel gross. And so that's why it took me so long to really start looking into my spirituality, and finding, the right thing for me. Almost 29, and I'm finally finding it.
And I think that's so important that you shared that, because so many of us, like right from me being subtly undermined and devalued and not even considered to exist or to be acceptable, but in this very kind of quiet, polite English way, right up to the very blatant abuse and shaming that happened in your situation. We hear a lot about this in our community as well, don't we? Like, just generally the LGBT community. We all, well, not all of us, but a lot of us have stories about this. And of course, it's important to mention that plenty of our sort of queer siblings have good relationships with their religion or whatever, or the spirituality. However, this sort of trauma is definitely rampant. And I think it's really important to share that and raise awareness. And I often want to tread like a middle ground with all of these things in a way that accepts everybody. And I literally mean everybody in their various views and beliefs. But I think, aside from the superiority complex that I mentioned before, that a lot of these organizations depend upon for loyalty, is also the concept of not questioning anything. And I think that the way that these things can, so for example, I'll share my story and you'll share yours, and yet somebody else will come along and go, oh, that's a very rare occurrence, or those things don't happen very much, like most religions are benevolent, or most religious centers, temples, synagogues, or whatever, they do more good than bad. It starts to become an argument against or
Yeah.
for religion. And I think that that is really counterproductive, because ultimately you've got a bunch of people who are traumatized and say, like, religion has fucked my life up, or it's at least left me with a scar. So fuck religion. And then you've got the other side that says, but this is how I live my life. This is how I love people. This is the thing that means so much
Mhm.
to me. This is what I depended upon when my grandpa was dying or something, and this is what got me through losing a pregnancy or whatever. So you've got these two very emotionally charged things. And I think that continuing both of those narratives, whilst they're totally valid to the individual, they're not inclusive enough for everyone. And whilst I wouldn't suggest for a moment that we kind of give up our own things to be 50-50 or something, I think it's really important to learn to be critical of your response versus, or as well as, what is the most productive way that we can do this. And I think that, especially for religious people who are very indoctrinated and have grown up in a culture where they're not allowed to question things, I think that's the most difficult part of all. Because I mean, when you're an atheist, you don't go to an atheist church. You just stay at home, or you go to your friend's house, or you go to the cinema, or you go and get some chicken and chips or something. Do you know what I mean? When you're an atheist, you don't have a replacement for that. You don't go to fucking atheist school where they teach you all of these things about religion and laugh about it. Or, I mean, I guess that goes on to some extent anyway, secularly. But what I'm saying is that I think it's much easier when nobody's indoctrinated you into religion. It's much easier to then be critical of religion. But when you're in it, and particularly when you've got people around you or on Facebook who are taking the piss out of your religion or being disrespectful, then you're going to keep defending it over and over again. And especially when you've already been told anyone who says anything against you is dirty, or they're a sinner, or they're a heathen, or whatever. You know, it's not difficult for me as a non-religious person to talk about a spiritual concept, especially like having done my own healing and found my own grounding within it, and something that, you know, feels right to me, and very relaxed and just totally loving, and also very practical. I find that easy. But I do think that I don't know what the answer is. I don't know what your thoughts are, Jordan, but I think when you, like I said before, you've got these two very emotionally charged sides to this kind of battle, and
Yeah,
I don't know.
I don't feel like there really is an answer right
I
now,
don't know what
because
we do
you
about
said
that.
it. It's two very emotionally charged sides, and there's a lot of hurt. I just don't know. Like, the best you can is to be accepting and loving as you can,
Mm.
but I don't think there's really a way to create total peace between them, if that makes sense. It's a lot of time.
Not at the moment. I definitely think it would take a lot of time, and also I think a loosening of the reins to trust your followers that they really do love you, and that it's not going to take one conversation or even 10 conversations with a stranger to, you know, take you astray. I'm very much of the opinion that if your faith is that strong, you know, think of Job and stuff, like, it doesn't matter how many trials and tribulations you go through. If you're going to end up, if that's your belief forever, it will be your belief forever. But if you have to avoid speaking to people and avoid loving people too much, or being too accepting for fear that your faith won't stand up to that, it's not
Uh,
real, right? Or it's only skin deep, or you're only doing it to survive. You're not doing it because you really want to. But I do think it's going to take a bit of loosening and a bit of vulnerability and a bit of like not indoctrinating people, actually giving them an education about their spirituality. So all the things that I've learned uh, since being comfortable enough to do my own reading, I like a lot of the tenets of many religions now, because I think it's so beautiful and universal and really does encourage the best in us. But the way it's utilized and used in modern day religion is not reflective of any of that at all, as far as I'm concerned. And like you were saying, you're exploring your spirituality outside of religion, as have I. And in that time, I think we must come across things all the time that are so positive and holistic and helpful, and in no way judgmental. And it's truly like nourishing stuff, and it makes us useful to other people and happier within ourselves. And I think that if you actually allowed people to question these things for themselves and come back, they would be a much better disciple of your religion anyway, because they're allowed to think about it.
yeah.
They're not terrified that somebody's going to start like putting a horse head in their bed, or or doing, you know, or threatening them or excommunicating them or ruining their local reputation just because they wanted to have a conversation about it. Yeah, I think you find much more powerful disciples and loyal and well-rounded, like better educated and stuff. And oh yeah, so that's what I was saying, that so many of the things that I've discovered about religion in general, and particularly Christianity, since being comfortable enough to learn all this stuff, has really blown my mind. It's so magic, and I just think they never talk about this in church, and they never, all the Christians I know don't even know this stuff, and about the culture that their prophet and their Messiah has come from. They don't even know half of this stuff, and it's such a shame, because I think so many of these things are the magical part of it. But yeah, I don't really know where I was going with that. Okay. Yeah. I think there's a lot of fear. There's a lot of fear and trauma in all of these things, isn't it? I think that any time you've got an argument, anytime you've got a big clash, it's trauma and fear. There's often control in there, you know, bit of abuse just to top it off. How shall we sign off on this one, George?
Thanks for coming. See you later. Have a good night.
Bye.
Well, I mean that's good. Yeah, exactly.
I
Right.
go to bed now. I need a wee. Thanks for joining us on this really deep and intense conversation about religion, being queer, and abuse of power. Make yourself a cup of
I'm gonna
tea
go
and
do that
maybe
right
give
now.
yourself a little
I need
cuddle.
it. I deserve it. Glad we had this conversation.
Yeah.
Next time we'll make sure to make it a lot
For
more
sure.
lighthearted and maybe get some more dick jokes in because I feel lost without them. But thanks for joining us, and hopefully we'll catch you next time.
Definitely. And if you want to tweet us about your own experiences or your own opinions, or you've got any feedback for us, we're at Transection P on Twitter. You can also find us on Instagram at Transection Podcasts, and on Facebook, the Transection Podcast. And don't forget, if you haven't done it already, don't miss out. This is top quality stuff. I've told you this before and you still didn't do it because you're still not on the list. Okay. So sign up at www.muxharrishill.com/transection. You can get this beautiful stuff sent directly to you from me and George, straight to you.
Ta-ta
What
for
more
now.
could you want? Join us next time, and until then, build bridges and have fun.